It's plain and obvious to any right-thinking person that Israel's war isn't just about targeting a militant group, it's about destroying the basis of life for 2 million Palestinians. That's included the bombing of whole families, the deprivation of food to 2 million people, and as we've now been reminded in tragic fashion, the casual murder of people trying to deliver much-needed food. And it's also involved the systematic destruction of hospitals. I spoke to another volunteer who risked life and limb to provide support for the besieged people of Gaza. Nick Maynard is a consultant surgeon who has worked in Gaza with medical aid for Palestinians, including a 2-week stint this January at Al-Aqsa Hospital. I began our conversation by asking Nick to outline his experiences working in Gaza earlier this year.
I've been going to Gaza for nearly 15 years, since 2010, so I know the healthcare system there extremely well. I've worked in the hospitals, I've operated in the operating theatres, and I assumed that I would be ready for what I was going to see when I went out there at the end of December and into January of this year. And I think it's fair to say it was far, far worse than I had expected. The healthcare system there is in a state of near total collapse. I was working in Al-Aqsa Hospital, which was at the time thought to be one of the properly functioning hospitals, but it wasn't properly functioning at all, and none of the hospitals are functioning in Gaza. It was receiving huge numbers of trauma victims. The capacity of the hospital was 3 or 4 times what was normal, and it couldn't cope with those numbers of victims. It couldn't treat anything else other than trauma. So the healthcare system had virtually collapsed, and we saw just the most awful injuries, in many of them in small children, multiple traumatic amputations, terrible burns which were unsurvivable. And I spent most of my time operating on people with severe bomb injuries to the abdomen and to the chest. So yes, it was far worse than I expected, and really horrific things that we saw.
Leading the news over the past 24 hours has been sort of the tragic death of these 3 British aid workers. Of course, big news here because they're British citizens. Lots of medics have, of course, also been killed over the past 6 months. Did you sort of question whether it was a good idea to go to Gaza knowing that aid workers and medics were really risking their lives by even being in the Gaza Strip?
Yes, I did. I questioned it a lot, and I spoke at length to my wife, my children who are all adults now, but I spoke to them, and even my elderly 94-year-old mother I spoke to at length, and my siblings. So it was not a decision taken lightly, but I have very strong connections to Gaza. I have many close friends, people I'd call family out there, and their need was absolutely enormous. I spoke to them on the phone or WhatsApped them, and they were begging for help. So I felt I had no option but to do so. But I was very aware of the risks, and I did have the huge support of my wife and family in going out there.
I imagine the support of your, as you say, your wife and family was absolutely essential here. What about the British state? So did you get any support from the British government to say, look, you're a British citizen, you're going to Gaza to do something that any right-minded person, would see as being a very worthy, righteous thing to do? You're going there to help people get medical care in a war zone. Did the British government sort of provide you with any support that you thought sort of reassured you that you would be safe there?
No, to be honest, we didn't seek a huge amount of support from the government. I went in with Medical Aid for Palestinians, which is a wonderful UK charity, and we had enormous support from them. They're wonderful staff in the UK, but they're truly inspirational staff on the ground in Gaza. So we had huge support from them, but the government, we didn't seek their approval or not. We went in with MAP through the WHO emergency medical team mechanism. We did meet up with members of representatives from the UN when we were in Cairo. We met up with the deputy ambassador in Cairo. But to be honest, the briefing that they had been fairly minimal, and so we really went in mainly with the faith in medical aid for Palestinians, and they were a wonderful support to us when we were there.
And we keep hearing from, especially Israeli spokespeople over the past 24 hours or so, they seem to be saying, oh, yes, this World Central Kitchen, this organization, actually, these are genuine humanitarians. These were some of the good guys. And so we are genuinely sorry for, well, actually, they haven't said sorry, but it was a genuine mistake, or it's regretful that they have been killed, I think is some of the language that's being used by the Israelis. Now, when they call World Central Kitchen some of the good guys, the implication tends to be that lots of the other people who are doing humanitarian work in Gaza aren't. Right, so there's a real attempt to sort of smear shed loads of people working for all sorts of different organizations as, closet Hamas fighters. I mean, how have you felt sort of over the past 24 hours seeing the way that this particular tragedy, these 7 aid workers being killed, has been treated somewhat differently to the 200 other aid workers who've been killed over the past 6 months?
I don't pay any real attention to what the Israeli government or the Israeli Defense Force have said. I think they are lying. I do not attach any credibility to their statements. This is something we have seen repeatedly since October the 7th, repeated attacks on healthcare workers. I've met, as you can imagine, many, many healthcare workers and aid workers in Gaza, and they are, without exception, the most remarkable group of people, utterly inspirational people who put their lives at risk to go and help the innocent Gazan civilians who are being destroyed by the attacks from the Israeli Defense Force. So this is, I'm really pleased the media is making this story so prominent, but one could equally question why the media hasn't given prominence to many other stories of attacks on healthcare workers and aid workers that have been repeatedly occurring since October the 7th. Witnessing what has happened has been horrific. And I think the world needs to realize that the Israeli Defense Force are deliberately attacking healthcare workers, aid workers. The whole healthcare system is being systematically destroyed by the Israeli Defense Force and dismantling it to make Gaza utterly uninhabitable. So they are behaving as they have done over the last 6 months.
We've heard actually stories of Israelis, and this is coming often from medics who have been working in Gaza, of Israeli troops intentionally targeting medics and people sort of taking off their scrubs because they think that wearing their scrubs, so their medical gear, that could specifically make them a target. Now, was that something that you were sort of aware of when you were in Gaza? Did you feel that sort of identifying yourself as a doctor put yourself under more threat from the IDF?
I didn't experience that when I was at Al Aqsa, but that was almost 3 months ago. And I think, to be fair, I mean, we were the very first UK medical team that went into Gaza. And I think we believed the deconfliction process was going to work. Every day we had to, or our MAP Gazan representatives had to contact COGAT to ensure that the route to the hospital and the hospital were deconflicted. And we believed in that process. Now, maybe that was naive of us, but we believed in it at the time. But we realized towards the end of our stay that it meant very little to be told by the IDF that the area was deconflicted. And our experience at Al Aqsa Hospital, we had to withdraw from the hospital 2 days before the end of our stay because there was a missile attack by the IDF on the intensive care unit just a few meters away from the operating theatre that I was operating in at the time, saving a young lady's life who had been blown up by an Israeli bomb. So we lost faith in the deconfliction process since then. And I think what we've seen repeatedly over the last few weeks has reinforced that view that the Israeli Defense Force are not protecting aid workers and healthcare workers. And the stories that we've all heard about doctors changing out their scrubs, putting on civilian clothes because they don't want to be targets. And I've heard that from people I know at Shifa Hospital in the last few days before it was completely destroyed. So yes, they are targeting healthcare workers. I know people who've been killed at Shifa Hospital. A doctor, a plastic surgeon, who I met when I was in Shifa Hospital last May, was executed with his mother 3 days ago. We've seen photographs of healthcare workers handcuffed with hands behind their back, having been killed. So yes, they are being deliberately targeted.
I just want to ask you to sort of flesh out. You've said this doctor that you know was executed with his mother. I mean, can you give us any more details about? I mean, first of all, our condolences for this person that you clearly know and have a lot of affection for has been killed in a brutal way. But could we get some more sort of details from you of precisely what you understand happened in that situation?
I've heard this from a close friend of mine who is chief of surgery at Shifa Hospital, who's been interviewed in the last 2 or 3 days. And I've seen photographs. I met this surgeon. He was not a close friend. I met him when I was operating in Shifa Hospital last May. But I know people who know him extremely well. And he was a hardworking, young plastic reconstructive surgeon. And he was one of the doctors who stayed in Shifa Hospital whilst it's been besieged over the last 2 weeks. And he and his mother, who was a physician there as well, were both killed by Israeli Defense Force soldiers the other day, and their bodies were discovered by friends of mine in the hospital.
And so this is in Shifa, isn't it? So this is where we're hearing from the Israelis. They say, oh, yes, lots of people were killed at Shifa, but the people who were killed were militants, and that's because Shifa was being used essentially as a base for Hamas fighters. Now, you're saying some of the people who were killed at Shifa, and they were doctors, right? They were not militants. What do you make of that claim that Israel keeps putting forward that, well, first of all, they say, oh, we didn't mean to kill anyone. And they say, oh, we did kill them, but actually they were Hamas. In the specific circumstances of Shifa, perhaps, what have you made of those Israeli claims that it was being used as a base for militants?
Clearly, I haven't been in Shifa in recent weeks, so I can only go by what has been told to me by my close friends and colleagues whom I've known for many, many years. But I've worked in Shifa Hospital. I was there in May of last year operating. I've been there on many occasions in the past. On every visit, I have had unrestricted access to every part of the hospital, and I have never seen any evidence of any military activity, no evidence of Hamas militants in all the visits I've had to Shifa. Now, I haven't been there in recent weeks, so I have to rely upon the testimony of people I've known for many years. But these are people who I trust implicitly. They're doctors. They're in Shifa Hospital saving lives as much as they possibly can. And I have heard repeated testimonies from such people saying that there is no evidence to support the contention that Shifa Hospital has been used as a command center.
I wondered if we could just return. There was something you mentioned in a previous answer that I would like to get some more detail on, because it sounds quite a shocking situation. So you're saying there was a moment in Al-Aqsa Hospital where you were conducting surgery on someone when an Israeli missile lands sort of at a building nearby, if I recall that correctly. I wondered if you could just sort of talk about that experience. What happens when you're in an operating room and then all of a sudden you hear a bomb land incredibly nearby? What are the moments that follow that situation?
I was operating in Al-Aqsa Hospital on a young lady who was a victim of a bomb explosion. We're hearing bombs going off the whole time. So the whole of my 2 weeks in Gaza, virtually non-stop, you could hear bombs going off. Where we were staying, we barely slept at night because of the amount of times that bombs are going off and the house was shaking, or we heard machine gun fire. And in the hospital, it was similar. We could hear bombs going off all the time. So to be honest, you just crack on with your work and you believe in the process that the deconfliction process that you've been assured by COGAT that the hospital will be protected. And so when we heard another bomb going off, we didn't really change what we were doing. We just carried on operating. It was only when I'd finished the operation and came out of the operating theatre at about 2:45 on afternoon that I heard that the intensive care unit had been attacked by a missile attack. And we then saw lots of victims coming in from single gunshot wounds. And bear in mind that virtually all the victims we were seeing over two were bomb victims. It was unusual seeing gunshot victims, and there was a lot of talk about Israeli snipers being in the close environment of the hospital and was shooting individuals. Now, I would stress I did not see any snipers, but there was a lot of talk about them, and we certainly saw a lot of people coming in with single gunshot wounds. And the intensive care unit wall had a huge hole in it. Now, no one was killed by that, but it was a clear missile attack by the IDF. And that led to our rapid withdrawal from Al-Aqsa Hospital for safety reasons. MSF were in the hospital as well. They evacuated immediately as well. And so overnight, all foreign doctors left the hospital. And of course, that gives a very clear signal to the local doctors. And they all, or not all of them, but many of them withdrew from the hospital. So as a result of that missile attack on the intensive care unit, the whole hospital became rapidly disabled for probably about 2 weeks until it started working again. So it was a really dramatic effect on the workforce of the hospital because of that attack.
Of course, we might be seeing a similar process now in terms of food provision, because it's people who are sort of carrying out the distribution of food who are finding themselves killed by the Israeli military, and that will have a massive knock-on effect on the other people's sort of ability to carry out their jobs, their sort of very important tasks. Finally, it's been very difficult for foreign media to enter Gaza to sort of get a sense of what is going on the front line, on the ground in Gaza. So it's medics and other volunteers who have been, I suppose, some of the people with the best ability to speak about what is actually going on the ground. And I suppose I want to know from you if you feel like the British political establishment, so the government or the opposition, do you feel like the reality you have been describing is being taken on board by the British government? Do you think you're being taken seriously?
I think belatedly, yes, but it's taken a long time. I've had meetings, and others have had meetings with senior members of the government and the Foreign Office, and they did take notice. And I believe the messaging coming out, certainly from Lord Cameron, has changed in recent weeks. One could argue this is far too late, that it's 6 months down the road. But I think they are now beginning to take heed of what people on the ground in Gaza are telling them about the atrocities that are taking place. Now, we all wish for stronger actions from our governments, because that is the only way the Israelis will be stopped. And at the moment, they are still carrying out these appalling atrocities, really without any restriction at all from the rest of the world.